H.L. Mencken was one of the most recognizable voices in 20th century American journalism. Known for his sharp wit, cynicism, and skepticism, he kept America on its toes. People may not have agreed with Mencken, but everyone knew his opinion of the day. Henry Louis Mencken was born in Baltimore in 1880, the son of a middle-class cigar maker and a loving mother. He grew up loving books like Huck Finn and Lord Jim that would leave an impression on him well until his adult years. Early on, his father gave him a small printing press, and in setting up the toy for his son, accidentally broke the letter R off the press, which is very inconvenient for a little boy named Henry. Inscribed on all of Henry's writings thereafter was the name that everyone in the world would know him by, H.L. Mencken. The country's most famous cynic had an idyllic childhood. So ideal, in fact, he lived in his childhood home for the rest of his life, the only exception being the 5 years he was married. After his father's death when Mencken was just 19 years old, he left the family cigar business for journalism at the Baltimore Herald. By the age of 25, he would be running the newspaper. After the Baltimore fire in 1904, Mencken would go to the Baltimore Sun, which he would contribute to off and on for the rest of his life. Journalism was one of the most exciting careers a man like Mencken could enter into, as urban areas like Baltimore grew along with an increase in literacy for the working class. But soon the hard-working Mencken wanted more. He began writing as a literary critic for the Smart Set, a magazine that reviewed the literature and theater popular of the day. At the Smart Set, Mencken would meet George Jean Nathan, a theater critic who would be a great influence on Mencken's professional life. Mencken and Nathan would leave the Smart Set to begin the American Mercury magazine in 1924. Known for its small green cover, the American Mercury quickly became a flapper favorite, publishing the early works of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dorothy Parker, and Langston Hughes. Mencken used the magazines and newspapers he wrote for to criticize the parts of America he hated the most. Mostly he hated the many Americans who believed in religion, especially Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science that believed that illness was only an illusion that faith could cure. Mencken even broke off a long-time love affair with Marion Bloom because she became a Christian Scientist. Mencken also hated Puritanism with a passion. He believed Puritanism kept people ignorant. Mencken became more convinced of this when Reverend J. Frank Chase tried to censor the American Mercury, calling one of its stories about a prostitute pornographic, landing Mencken a brief stay in jail when Mencken continued to sell the so-called pornographic materials. Mencken would have his revenge, however, on the fundamentalists at the 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee. The American Civil Liberties Union contacted H.L. Mencken when the ACLU decided to provide the defense for John Scopes, who was arrested for teaching evolution in a public school. The ACLU consulted with Mencken about the pathology of Southern fundamentalist Christians. The prosecution was being headed by the famed William Jennings Bryan, a two-time presidential hopeful and former Secretary of State. Mencken had absolutely no respect for either Bryan's big government politics or his fundamentalist theology. Mencken is credited for giving defense attorney Clarence Darrow the idea to put William Jennings Bryan on the stand as a Bible expert. Mencken was sent to Dayton, Tennessee to cover the trial for the Baltimore Sun, but missed Bryan's testimony on his inconsistent beliefs of whether biblical stories are literal or figurative. Although Scopes lost the trial, the history of the trial comes to us from much of what Mencken wrote as a nationally syndicated writer, coining the Scopes trial as the monkey trial of the infidel Scopes. A play and movie about the Scopes trial also was written in the spirit of Mencken. Mencken shows up in the film version of Inherit the Wind as E.K. Hornbeck, played by a cigar-chomping Gene Kelly. In 1929, Mencken married his longtime love interest, Sarah Powell Hart. She was an English professor at a local Baltimore college and had even published in Mencken's Smart Set magazine long before they had even met. Hart was originally from Montgomery, Alabama. Her playmates were the future Mrs. Zelda Fitzgerald and Tallulah Bankhead, future Hollywood royalty. Sarah was in poor health, suffering from tuberculosis all her married life, dying of meningitis after 5 years of marriage. Mencken was heartbroken and never got over her death and never remarried. Unfortunately for President Roosevelt, all of Mencken's energy and anger thereafter would be focused on Roosevelt's New Deal. Mencken had been at the Democratic Convention when Roosevelt was nominated in 1932, covering the story for the Baltimore Sun. Many would be surprised to know that Mencken had voted for Roosevelt, considering that Mencken spent the entirety of Roosevelt's presidency fighting his domestic and international policies in his newspaper articles. It is also surprising to know that Mencken even wrote a warm account of Roosevelt's victory in a book titled Making a President, a Footnote in the Saga of Democracy, right after Roosevelt won the presidency. It is reported that Roosevelt approved of the admiring book. Later it was Roosevelt's New Deal policies that would outrage Mencken, saying of Roosevelt, "He is directly and solely responsible for every dollar that has been wasted, for every piece of highfalutin rubbish that has been put upon the statute books, and for the operations of every mountebank on the public payroll from the highest to the lowest. He was elected to the presidency on his solemn promise to carry on the government in a careful and sensible manner, and to put only competent men in office. He has repudiated that promise openly, deliberately, and in the most cynical manner." Mencken continued to write about politics and pop culture with both humor and skepticism until his stroke in 1948 made it hard for Mencken to write and speak. He left behind his legacy in his thousands of articles and letters, as well as several books on the subjects that were dearest to him. He has contributed to American journalism and literature, not just his own writings, but also by being the first to publish many unknown writers in his Smart Set and American Mercury magazines, like F. Scott Fitzgerald. His oft-quoted one-liners are still funny and relevant more than 80 years later. While it may be strange to count H.L. Mencken as a prominent voice of the 1920s and 30s, considering he hated jazz, refused to drive, never flew on an airplane, or even left his much-loved surroundings of his childhood home, he still made an impression on the American landscape. The Mencken tradition of current events mixed with humor and pop culture can still be seen today by way of hip intellectual favorites Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert.